When he first walked into the room, nobody noticed him, not in the way he needed to be noticed. The chandelier threw lazy light across champagne flutes and conversations. Laughter spilled like coin down the marble halls. He moved through it all like a ghost sampling a banquet, answering the occasional glance with a hopeful smile that wanted to insist, "Please see me. Please remember me." He had trained himself for attention the way some men trained for sport. He practiced punchlines, polished anecdotes, learned the right entrance, the right laugh. He could make people look at him, briefly. He could command the small stage of a conversation with the confident volume of a practiced performer. But attention and presence are not the same thing. In that room, attention glittered and moved away as fast as it arrived. By the time he reached a cluster of strangers, the conversation had moved on. The energy had already settled around younger faces, louder jokes, someone else's confident tangent. He left having been heard, but not remembered. He experienced that evening as a string of small, scattered validations that never compiled into anything sustained. Outside, the night air was close. He stood on the curb, hands deep in his coat, listening to the echo of other people's voices from inside. There, in the chorus of that emptiness, the two most persistent voices in his head spoke up. The first was the loud one. Make more noise, he should have thought. Fight for space. The second, quieter but more stubborn, said, "What if the noise is the problem? What if someone else's quiet could actually change the topography of the room?" This is where his story starts, not at a moment of triumphant discovery, but in a small, private question that refuses to go away. What if power could be chosen, not taken? What if being magnetic didn't mean performing louder than everyone else, but standing in a different relation to the room? He did not become magnetic overnight. He did not buy a formula or swear allegiance to a guru. He chose an experimental life, small acts, incremental shifts, repeated often enough to alter his internal compass. He began by noticing the difference between noise and power. Noise arrives loud and fast. It demands reactions. It raises pitch and posture, fills silence with stories and confessions. It can be thrilling. It can be useful. But it also exhausts and fragments. Power, on the other hand, is less about volume and more about gravity. Power asks a room to rearrange itself around a presence that is steady, reliable, and quietly useful. Power does not have to shout to be noticed. It instead occupies less space, yet tends to hold that space longer. If you imagine the scene from above, you can see how the dynamics play out. In the noisy model, the spotlight hops from one face to another. In the powerful model, a still point draws the spotlight in, like a stone in a pond making concentric waves. That still point was what he decided to practice. He would choose power over noise. He started with the myth. Charisma is innate. For most of his life, he had assumed that people were born like either magnets or satellites, some naturally drawing people in, others orbiting uncertainly on the periphery. The myth is comforting because it absolves effort. If charisma is a birthright, then trying hard feels futile. But believing the myth also creates a scarcity mindset. If there are only so many charismatic people to go around, then each social encounter is a competition for scarce attention. The truth he learned, the one that would shape everything he did afterward, was that charisma is a pattern of behaviors and habits that can be learned, refined, and embodied. It is not magic. It is a set of practical skills applied consistently. The distinction matters. Magic implies luck. Skills imply practice. The man chose practice. He began with small experiments. The first experiment happened at an office meeting 2 weeks after that party. He walked into the conference room with no prepared joke, no anecdote to command the hour. He sat down, intentionally at the center of the table, but he did not fill the silence when the room hesitated to begin. He breathed quietly and let the silence stretch. The noisy performer in the room, a colleague who habitually interrupted with loud opinions, leaned forward, ready to fill the gap. The man did nothing.
After a beat, a junior team member offered a thoughtful question. The noisy performer answered in the usual fashion, but it was the junior member's curiosity that set the tone for the entire meeting. People listened. The man felt the different gravity of being the still point. A voice did not need to be loud to be consequential. There are two lessons here. One is tactical. When you resist the urge to fill every silence, you allow others to contribute more honest, higher quality material. The second is psychological. Choosing not to perform reduces the internal pressure to be liked instantly. It opens the possibility of being respected later. The man learned to regard silence as a tool, not a threat. That meeting didn't make him a master. The noisy performer still sometimes dominated, and sometimes the man's silence read as disengagement. Early experiments produced mixed results. He would misread a room, hold an uncomfortable pause too long, or come off as aloof. Each misstep taught him something vital. Presence isn't passive, it's an active discipline that requires calibration, reading the room, sensing thresholds, and offering just enough input to convert attention into influence. If he had to label the internal obstacles that kept him performing, two stood out. First, the old habit of scarcity thinking, the sense that every moment of silence is a lost opportunity someone else will seize. Second, a fear of invisibility, the idea that unless he filled a space, space would forget him. Both these tendencies favored noise.
He began to practice shifting from a scarcity orientation to an abundance orientation. Abundance, as he learned it, is not extravagance. It is a perception that value is not zero-sum. When you operate from abundance, you believe there are many ways to add value in any social field, through questions, through connection, through being the person who remembers names, who follows up, who introduces others. Scarcity makes you grab, abundance makes you give. That reversal mattered, because giving is a stronger lever for social influence than grabbing. People remember the giver. The psychological shift came through a simple daily ritual. Each morning he set an intention. Where can I create value today? This question pushed his attention outward, away from how he would appear and toward what he could contribute. The effect was subtle but cumulative. Conversations became less about proving himself and more about noticing needs, curiosities, frustrations, desires, and responding with useful offerings. The act of noticing itself increased his magnetism. When others feel seen and served, they orient back toward you. He was also learning to befriend discomfort. Choosing power over noise meant he would sometimes be ignored, sometimes his silence would be misread. He had to let go of the immediate comfort of applause in exchange for a longer arc of trust and respect. That is the risk. You sacrifice short-term attention for the possibility of long-term influence. It is not always the safer choice socially, but over time it tends to change what people offer you, not because you commanded it, but because you became reliably useful and anchored. One morning, he caught himself in the doorway of a coffee shop, watching how people moved through small groups. A woman laughed loudly, waving her hands. 4 other people mirrored her energy and gravitated toward her. Across the room, a man in a blue coat sat with his laptop, speaking softly to a colleague, his gestures economical. People leaned in, eyes narrow with curiosity. The man noticed the difference. The loud laugh grabbed a moment. The quiet conversation held attention. That doorway image became a motif for him. Standing in the doorway, choosing whether to step in and compete or to stand slightly back and calibrate. He practiced standing in other doorways too, at the entrance to a hotel ballroom, outside the glass doors of a conference center, in the threshold of a meeting room. In each place, he tried a simple physical experiment. He took 3 slow breaths, placed his feet hip-width apart, relaxed his shoulders, and softened the volume of his internal monologue.
The effect was not dramatic at first, but after a week of repeating it, he noticed a small change. He felt less keyed to immediate reactions. In conversations, his interruptions diminished. He discovered that a single calm body tended to invite other calm bodies to match its rhythm.
Presence is partly posture and breath, but largely the story you tell yourself about permission to be quiet. If you believe silence equals invisibility, you'll fill it. If you believe silence can be fertile, you let it be. He practiced the latter. The man also began to study the mechanics of first impressions. Researchers often note the primacy of early cues, the short, rapid evaluations we make in the first seconds of meeting someone. He experienced this as the 7-second judgment, though he resisted turning it into a deterministic law. Instead, he used it as a reminder. The first moments set a tone that is hard to shift, but possible to reframe. He tested this in low-stakes environments. At a grocery store checkout, he practiced making eye contact and offering a genuine, quiet greeting rather than a rehearsed compliment. At the elevator, he stood a touch straighter and listened for the other's rhythm. He paid attention to micro-cues, the way someone's shoulders rose when they were anxious, the quick glance to a phone when they wanted to exit a conversation. These small calibrations told him who needed space and who needed gentle invitation. One afternoon, in the lobby of a law firm where he had a brief coffee, he met a young associate with a handshake that was both hurried and apologetic. Most people would have rushed to make a bright joke to smooth the awkwardness. He chose instead to slow his breathing, lower his voice a notch, and ask a simple, open question. "What has your week been like?" The associate blinked, surprised by the non-demanding tone. He exhaled as if some pressure lifted and offered a candid answer. Within 2 minutes, the associate had shifted posture, giving him a small window of authentic exchange that the man would later use to build a genuine connection. It was not a performance, it was a recalibration. The associate left the conversation feeling noticed, and he, in turn, was remembered. These small wins taught a larger principle. Presence amplifies the meaning of what you say. Words are cheap. The bodily environment you create around them gives them weight. A declarative sentence spoken in haste can evaporate. The same sentence, offered with measured breath and direct eye contact, tends to land. The man began to think of his body as a broadcast antenna, not for volume, but for frequency. He tuned it to steadiness. But presence without empathy can misfire. Early in his experiment, he made the mistake of assuming that being more composed meant listening less. He had to learn that presence is best paired with deep listening. Deep listening is not merely the absence of speech, it is the active practice of understanding what is unsaid, the half-finished sentences, the subtle shifts in tone, the trembling of enthusiasm in someone's voice. It requires curiosity and the humility to learn. He developed a few concrete listening habits.
One was to paraphrase what the other person had said before offering his own perspective. "It sounds like you." This small move did not put words in someone's mouth, it returned structure to their thought and signaled that he was tracking their inner logic. Another habit was to ask one more question than felt comfortable. If a conversation could stop after 2 exchanges, he would ask a third question that gently probed for values rather than facts. These were not tricks, they were choices to prioritize understanding over impression. Several of his experiments showed the compound effect of combining presence with deep listening. In a small networking breakfast, he met a woman who ran an education nonprofit. Instead of pitching his ideas, he asked about her programs, the pain points she encountered, and the stories that kept her going. He listened with his body leaning slightly forward, nodding at the right moments, and then asked a single focused question about a partnership she had mentioned.
That question opened a corridor in the conversation that neither of them anticipated, a potential collaboration that later turned into a modest joint project. He didn't gain attention because he had performed a perfect line. He gained it because he had become the person who hand-delivered useful insight into the other person's problem. At the end of that week, after a string of small experiments and uneven results, he sat at his kitchen table with a notebook. He drew 2 columns, noise and power. Under noise, he wrote, quick jokes, loud anecdotes, relentless interruptions, a constant hunger for approval. Under power, he wrote steady voice, practical questions, calibrated silence, generous referrals. He kept reminding himself that these were tendencies, not moral judgments. The noisy strategies were not bad, they were simply different tactics that tended to produce shallow returns. The power strategies were quieter and slower, but tended to produce deeper, more durable connections. He wanted the latter. At the close of that first month of deliberate practice, he invited himself to a small test, a 1-minute breathing practice before entering any social interaction. He had learned this from a coach who taught presence like a muscle. He would stand in a doorway, the coffee shop, the lobby, the office corridor, take 3 deliberately slow breaths, inhale into his diaphragm, feel his chest expand, and imagine sending the exhale into the space ahead of him. The practice wasn't mystical. It served 2 purposes. It slowed his internal tempo, and it signaled to his nervous system that he intended to be calm. Calmer breath tended to lower the pitch of his voice and enable him to listen more patiently. If this is speaking to you, stay with me and try the 1-minute breathing practice now. Find a doorway or simply sit. Inhale slowly for 4 counts into your belly. Hold briefly, then exhale for 6 counts. Repeat 3 times.
Notice any subtle changes in how you hold yourself and how your mind shifts. Come back when you're ready. When he resumed, the next set of events felt marginally different. He made more room for others. He noticed that when he slowed down, people often filled that space with something truer. But there were also disappointments. At a company holiday party, he stood quietly near the buffet and noticed how a group from marketing clustered like a small sun and how a local influencer performed in a way that drew the room with magnetized energy. He tried to stay present, but he found himself tempted to mimic their volume to get a momentary reaction. He tried once and misfired. His attempt to be witty landed awkwardly and he felt exposed. It reminded him that transforming habits involved messy attempts and regressions. The path to steady influence is not linear. He also began to notice other archetypes that clarified what he did and didn't want to become. There was the needy conversationalist, the person who interrupts to steer the talk back to themselves, who tries to win favor by excessive flattery or constant self-disclosure. Their attraction is often transactional and ephemeral. There was the noisy performer, brilliant at showmanship, excellent at getting attention, but sometimes at the cost of humility and listening. And there was the difficult opponent, a foil who responded to attention with antagonism, testing boundaries and temper. Observing these patterns taught him that different social types demand different responses, but the baseline that seemed to work across types was steady presence paired with curiosity. He began to catalog small, replicable behaviors that moved him away from performance and toward substance. One was the pause. After someone finished a sentence, wait 1 extra heartbeat before answering. The pause signaled that you were not racing to be heard and gave the other person a chance to add depth. Another was the focused question, a narrow query that invites a story rather than a yes-no answer. What was unexpected about that experience, instead of, did it go well? He practiced softening his smile so it was not a performance, but a true reflection of interest. At a client dinner a few weeks into his practice, he used these tools without thinking. A CFO, notoriously skeptical and direct, had been curt with several people at the table.
When the CFO turned his attention to the man, he did not attempt a joke or a sharp insight. He asked a short, sincere question about the CFO's perspective on the industry's path forward, and then held a professional, calm silence that allowed the CFO to articulate more than he had in the previous 10 minutes. The CFO's demeanor shifted subtly. He frowned less and expanded his answer. Afterwards, the CFO privately praised the man, remarking that he had been refreshingly direct and clear, and that he appreciated being listened to rather than interrupted.
This small exchange carried more weight than the man's earlier attempts at comedic bravado. Real influence, he was discovering, often looked like restraint. The work he was doing was not merely about social tricks, it cut into identity. With each small change, he found his internal narrative shifting from "I must be liked" to "I can be useful." That difference mattered. Usefulness has dignity. Performative likability asks for constant cheering. Being useful is also aligned with service, the ethical spine of influence. He began to understand influence as the ability to help a group move to better outcomes, to help individuals feel more seen and supported. Influence used poorly is coercive. Exercised as service, it amplifies the other person's agency. As he practiced, a steady pattern emerged. The rooms that previously relegated him to the periphery began to test him with small invitations. A colleague asked him privately for feedback. A stranger at a lecture sought his opinion on a book. None of these were huge wins, but together they were the signs of compounding change. Influence tends to grow slowly, invisibly, and cumulatively. The man began to sense that choosing power over noise had shifted the angle of his life toward a different set of returns. Fewer dramatic bursts of attention, more durable connections that led to meaningful collaborations. Not everything moved smoothly. He had moments of self-doubt, nights where he wondered if he had simply traded one insecurity for another. The noisy strategies had instant gratification. Quiet power asked for patience. There were also situations where his restraint misread a dynamic and cost him an opportunity. In a recruiting event, he held back too long and the candidate assumed disinterest, moving on to someone else. These losses reminded him that presence is not passive. It is not a refusal to act. It is a willingness to act from a centered place, and that requires calibration, choosing when to lead and when to follow. He began to formalize his approach into a set of simple practices that could be repeated. Each day included a 5-minute presence warm-up in which he checked posture, slowed breath, and reviewed one question to ask in his upcoming interactions. Each evening, he took notes on what had worked and where he had miscalibrated. These notes were not a scorecard of success, but a learning log. Over months, patterns emerged. He could see, for instance, that when he began a conversation with an offer of concrete value, a relevant contact, a resource, a perspective, the exchanges tended to become reciprocal quickly. When he led with performance, exchanges became transactional and hollow. There was a critical moment that tested his new orientation toward influence. A colleague had been passed over for a leadership opportunity and came to him seeking counsel. The colleague was raw with resentment and wanted someone to witness that injustice.
He could have given a rousing speech, vented alongside the colleague, and earned the warmth of solidarity. Instead, he chose to sit with the colleague and ask clarifying questions. What outcome do you want? What options have you considered? What would you risk to get there? The questions were not cold, they were practical and focused on agency. They helped the colleague see a path forward and turned indignation into a plan. That night, the colleague left more confident, and the man felt a quiet satisfaction that was not applause, but the deeper payoff of being useful. The shift from performative interaction to useful influence reframed his network. People began to reach out for introductions, for perspective, for collaboration. He found himself playing the role of connector more frequently, not because he wanted to be liked, but because connecting others amplified the network's overall value. This multiplier effect felt like a new kind of leverage. When you help two people discover mutual gain, the returns are not just social praise, they are real opportunities that ripple outward. And yet, Even as small successes accumulated, the man kept running into a recurring internal friction, the temptation to treat influence as a performance again. Social media, quick wins, and the human desire for immediate feedback all conspired to tug him back toward noise. He had to design countermeasures, simple rules he enforced to maintain alignment. One rule was no social media posting in the first hour after waking. Morning time was reserved for undistracted practice. Another was a rule to never attempt to solve someone's problem publicly. Meaningful assistance tended to happen in private. These rules were not rigid dogmas, but pragmatic constraints that kept the direction of his efforts steady. As he moved through these months, the doorway image returned often. More than a motif, it became a test. Would he enter a room and immediately compete, or would he step into the threshold, breathe, and let the room settle around him? He noticed that not everyone would follow his newfound rhythm. Some environments rewarded noise, and sometimes his quiet approach was slow to produce results. But in places that valued depth, steadiness, and reliability, his presence had begun to translate into influence. A new opportunity came in the third month, one that would later feel like a hinge point. He was invited to a panel discussion where a high-profile investor would be present. In the past, he might have prepared a sharp, attention-grabbing line to win minutes from the panel. This time, he prepared differently. He clarified 3 useful questions he could ask the investor. He practiced a short presence warm-up before stepping on stage. He rehearsed holding silence after each question to allow the investor to expand on an idea. It was a modest plan, but it represented a deeper commitment to the power over noise ethos.
He did not yet know how the investor would respond, and he did not expect miraculous results. He expected to learn. At the backstage door, surrounded by amplifiers and pre-show chatter, he felt his old impulse flare up. Tell a joke, be brilliant, secure that instant nod of approval. He paused in the door for a breath, imagined sending his exhale into the room, and stepped out with a calmness that surprised him. He asked the investor one of his 4 questions, waited, and listened. The investor paused, then gave a careful answer that moved the panel conversation into territory others had not explored. Afterwards, 2 people came up to him privately, saying the question had opened a useful avenue. The result was not fame, but it was a seed. The quiet move produced disproportionate return. He was still learning, still imperfect, but at the end of this stretch he understood something essential. Choosing power over noise is not about being more silent than the rest of the world. It is about using silence and steadiness as a lever to do more useful work. It meant being deliberate about when to speak and what to offer. It meant prioritizing the value you add over the applause you receive. The rest of his journey would bring deeper mechanics, precise breathing patterns that affect vocal tone, the way eye contact can be used to calibrate trust without intimidation, the micro-expressions that reveal a listener's hesitation, and tougher tests. He had not yet faced the negotiation that would later trip him into a new scale of stakes, nor the reconciliation that would demand both boundary setting and tenderness. Those scenes waited ahead. For now, he was building the scaffolding, small practices, a reframed mindset, the habit of choosing usefulness. One evening, as rain stitched itself down the window panes of his apartment, he opened his notebook and drew a small map, 3 columns labeled presence, listening, and value. Under each, he listed micro-habits to repeat: breath before speaking, paraphrase 1 sentence, offer 1 useful connection per week. He told himself that the work here was slow and that the compounding effect was real but delayed. He also wrote a personal guideline. Influence should always come with consent and clarity. Do not commandeer another person's choices. As he folded his notebook closed, he felt quieter than he had been a year earlier. Not quieter in resignation, but quieter in focus. The noise still existed,
and sometimes it was intoxicating, but it no longer felt like his only available strategy. He had chosen a path that favored long arcs over instant applause. He had chosen power over noise. He had, however, not yet answered the hardest question. Could that quiet power hold in a truly high-stakes confrontation? Could it change outcomes when pressures were high and personalities were combustible?
The test would come when a negotiation emerged that demanded both unwavering presence and the capacity to influence another person who resisted being influenced. He could sense, even before the meeting was scheduled, that this would be the kind of trial that either consolidated his new identity or revealed the old habits still waiting to be reclaimed. For now, the man prepared. He booked time to study the other side's likely interests, rehearsed the quiet questions he would use to probe them, and made sure he had alignments, a colleague who could back him up, a prepared alternative in case talks stalled. He did not want to convert influence into coercion. He wanted to prepare to serve mutual outcomes. That intention itself was a test of the new ethics he was trying to live by. As the rain softened into a steady drizzle, he stood once more in the doorway of his apartment, feeling the familiar pattern of anticipation and calm. He took 3 measured breaths, allowed the doorway to be a small threshold between the person he had been and the person he was trying to become, and then he turned off the light to sleep and practice another day. He woke before dawn, with the negotiation pressurized somewhere in his chest, like a knot that wouldn't loosen until he'd done the work he knew he needed to do. The meeting was hours away, and the problem felt both practical and personal. The other party had a reputation for testing limits, and the terms on the table would affect people beyond himself. He could feel the old urges, grandstanding to show strength, quick retorts to protect ground, the desire to prove his competence with clever lines. Instead, he reached for the tools that had started to change his life: a short warm-up, a checklist, and a rehearsal of questions that aimed to discover rather than persuade. Preparation for him had become less about scripting a performance and more about designing a field in which useful work could happen. He reviewed interests rather than positions, imagined the other side's likely pressures, and sketched a fallback plan that preserved dignity for both parties. He framed his intention in a single sentence he repeated like a talisman: serve the outcome, protect the relationship. That sentence kept him tethered to service rather than to victory. When he arrived at the negotiation room, the other team was already there, their lead brisk, a little tight, an associate fidgeting with a pen, a legal advisor watching with polite scrutiny. The room hummed with pre-talk energy, people leaning to check phones, a coffee ring on the table, the subtle hierarchy of who placed their briefcase where. He set his own case down, took the breath he'd practiced dozens of times, inhaling into his belly and letting the exhales slow his shoulders. He did not attempt to dominate the table with volume. He chose steadiness. The other lead opened with a direct statement that carried the scent of dismissal. He could have matched it with an equally sharp retort. Instead, he listened, letting the words land. Then he paraphrased, not to be clever, but to confirm he'd understood. It sounds like your main concern is preserving flexibility in the timeline while protecting cost certainty. The lead blinked. A softening followed, not capitulation, but recognition that someone in the room had heard the core worry. That small move changed the tone. He introduced one of his calibrated questions. If we got the timing and cost aligned the way you need, what would success look like next quarter? The question reframed the setting from position to problem. It invited mental movement. The lead answered differently than the opening salvo suggested, less combative, more practical. Each time a tense turn reappeared, the man used another tool, a brief emotional label to acknowledge tension. I can tell this is frustrating. A concise silence to let a point settle.
a pointed inquiry into incentives rather than motives. He also spoke in ownership language, using we where possible to suggest shared accountability without surrendering clarity. Midway through, the discussion hit a spike. The other team proposed a clause the man could not accept without significant downside. The room tensed. In an older life, he would have reflexively escalated, matching force with force. Instead, he normalized the friction. He named the problem, explained the consequences in practical terms, and offered an alternative that protected the other team's interest while addressing his own. By doing so, he modeled the trade-off rather than demanding it. When they pushed back, he invited a pause. Let's take a minute to consider what each side would lose if we accepted it as written. That suggestion reframed the moment from debate to decision-making. Later, after a protracted exchange, the other lead said something sharp that cut through civility and implied bad faith. The man felt the old adrenaline kick in, defend, strike back, reclaim status. He recognized the response as an enemy of steady influence. He did not let the remark be a provocation to spectacle. He labeled the emotion. I hear the anger in your voice. This is important to you. The label did not excuse the remark. It acknowledged heat and invited cooling. It worked, not because it was magic, but because it offered a new relational move. Instead of baiting a fight, he held a mirror that showed the emotion without amplifying it. By the end of the meeting, a settlement had been sketched that neither side would have signed at the start, not because one side had bent entirely, but because both had been asked to think in terms of outcomes and constraints rather than posturing. Afterwards, in the stairwell, someone from the other team, an associate who had been quiet in the room, thanked him for making the discussion easier to navigate. You listen in a way that's rare, she said.
The compliment landed differently this time because it was not sought. It was a byproduct of a steady approach that favored clarity over applause. That negotiation was not a miracle. It did not guarantee future wins, nor did it erase the fact that not every difficult interaction would resolve so cleanly. But it was proof that the same practices, the breath, the paraphrase, the calibrated question, the emotional label, ownership language, could change the trajectory of high-stakes encounters. They did so by lowering friction and enabling honest exchange. From that hinge onward, his practice deepened in specificity. He began studying subtler mechanics of presence that went beyond breath and silence, the textures of voice, the geometry of posture, the choreography of eye contact. He discovered that small changes in physiology translated into different perceptions of credibility. One afternoon, he worked through a vocal exercise with a speech coach, not to become louder, but to add resonance. He learned to drop the voice a half step at the sentence start to signal ownership, and to let it float warmer at the end of a question to invite response. Not every sentence needed this treatment, but applied sparingly, it changed the way listeners perceived intent. He learned the value of measured inflection and the economy of a lower pitch when he wanted to convey calm authority. These were technical refinements, and like all skills, they required repetition. In public settings, he paid attention to eye contact as a calibrating device. Prolonged gaze, he noticed, could register as intimidating in some contexts and as engaged in others. He practiced a soft triangle of attention. Meet someone's eyes for a beat longer than feels natural, then let the gaze slide to their mouth or to their hands and return again. This pattern signaled focus without pressure. He also developed a habit of orienting his torso slightly toward people he wished to include. A face turned but shoulders closed suggested curiosity without availability. The body, he found, was a constant, unspoken narrator of intentions. Micro-cues became a study in low-contrast signals. The way a listener's shoulders lifted, the tiny tightening around a mouth, the frequency of nods, each gave him information. He learned to treat them as data rather than judgments. When someone's fingers drummed, it often meant impatience. When their voice softened, it meant vulnerability. Interpreting these cues allowed him to pace and lead.
match breathing when someone was rushed, slow his tempo when a conversation needed depth, mirror a hand gesture to build rapport before introducing a subtle change in rhythm to lead the person toward calmer grounding. He used these skills in a rehearsal with a mentee who had been a compulsive interrupter.
Together, they built a micro-experiment. The mentee would tell a story for 2 minutes without being interrupted. The man would practice calibrated listening, paraphrase, and then ask one focusing question. After 3 sessions, the mentee reported that conversations felt richer and responses were less defensive. The success was incremental but real, and it illustrated another pattern. Influence was amplified when others felt understood rather than corrected. Parallel to his technical work, he sharpened his understanding of ethical influence. He had learned to spot the difference between persuasion as service and persuasion as manipulation. The dividing line was consent and clarity. Techniques could be used to open doors or to close them deceptively. To anchor himself, he wrote a simple maxim on a sticky note stuck to his laptop: add value, respect agency. Whenever he caught himself calculating a move solely for personal gain, the sticky note reminded him that sustainable influence depended on the other person's autonomy remaining intact. One evening at a charity gala, he saw the distinction played out. A well-known fundraiser worked the room, skillfully engaging donors with carefully timed stories and flattery. He observed, and he also watched a quiet volunteer who knew people's causes intimately and introduced 2 strangers who discovered a deep alignment. The fundraiser drew attention and big gifts that night. The volunteer catalyzed a partnership that would outlast the evening. Both forms produced results, but the man judged one as spectacle and the other as enabling. He preferred the latter because it multiplied others' agency rather than temporarily enhancing his own image. Handling difficult people remained a crucial skill. He faced several of them: the noisy performer who thrived on stage-stealing interruptions, the needy conversationalist who sought constant validation, and a particular rival who delighted in exposing weak spots. His strategy was not to punish or outshout, but to neutralize the drama with calm boundaries and redirection. With the noisy performer, he used reimbursement, acknowledging the person's contribution, then pivoting to others with a value-adding question that broadened the conversation. With the needy conversationalist, he set limits kindly. "I'd love to hear more, but I also want to give others space," then redirected by asking someone else a targeted, inviting question. The rival required a more nuanced approach. The first time they clashed publicly, the man had attempted to deflect with humor and was humiliated when the rival seized the moment to poke deeper. Later, he chose another tactic. He recognized the rival's need to test boundaries, which often masked insecurity. Instead of escalating, he used curiosity. "Tell me more about what concerns you." And when the rival responded with attack, he reflected the feeling and reframed the topic toward a shared interest the rival could not easily oppose.
That move disarmed the person without gratifying them with the spotlight of a fight. It did not guarantee friendship, but it reduced future conflict and protected relationships that mattered. He also developed a disciplined approach to reframing at emotional Aikido, redirecting aggressive energy without absorbing it. If an opponent was loud, he would not mirror that volume. He would acknowledge the heat and then shift the frame, from who is right to what is useful, from blame to solution. The technique was not passive, it was strategic. It required the courage to name what was happening, to offer an alternative frame, and to hold the line when the room tempted him back into reactivity. As he refined these tools, he also paid attention to the social architectures that sustained his new identity. He redesigned daily rhythms to protect clarity and capacity. Mornings were for quiet practice and creative work. Afternoons for meetings where he could deploy presence intentionally. Evenings for recovery and reading. He fortified sleep, invested in movement that grounded his body, strength training, walking, knowing that a tired nervous system undermined even the best intentions. He cultivated curiosity by scheduling time each week for learning and for connecting with people outside his echo chamber. These lifestyle habits were not glamorous, but they undergirded consistency. He measured the compounding effect of small contributions to his network. One mild gesture, a warm introduction between two colleagues, later birthed an initiative that brought funding and collaboration across organizations. He learned to think in leverage terms. Helping two people meet often produced more value than a single grandstanding moment. Over time, his role as a connector emerged organically. People trusted him not because he had performed once, but because he had repeatedly created useful intersections. Social systems offered exponential returns when tended ethically. He used a simple practice to keep reciprocity healthy. When someone accepted an introduction, he followed up a week later to check on progress, which created obligation-free care and kept relationships from fraying. He avoided debt-based reciprocity, never expecting a favor returned, because that mutated relationships into transactions. Instead, he cultivated a ledger of goodwill, where value flowed without precise accounting, knowing the network would recompose in unpredictable but generative ways. Not every experiment succeeded. He had setbacks that cut through confidence. At a product launch, he misinterpreted audience signals and led a line of conversation that felt tone-deaf. A mentorship he offered did not land. The mentee felt patronized despite his intentions. These episodes reminded him to stay humble and curious. They also reinforced the principle that practice is iterative and that the desire to be useful does not exempt one from causing inadvertent harm.
In such moments, he apologized, recalibrated, and sought feedback, which often restored trust faster than defensiveness would have. One of the tougher tests came from a relationship that mattered more than public influence, a friendship frayed by a miscommunication. The friend, someone who had a history of sharp reactions, accused him privately of being aloof and self-absorbed, charges that cut through him because they echoed earlier insecurities. At first, he felt defensive. The instinct to counter-argue or to demand justification tempted him. Instead, he applied the same framework he'd used in negotiations. He listened, paraphrased, and asked clarifying questions about desired outcomes. He accepted responsibility for the times he'd been distant. He resisted the urge to explain away his behavior with rationalizations about being busy. He named his intention to be more present and asked what would help rebuild trust. The conversation was slow and sometimes uncomfortable, but it moved both of them toward repair. The friend did not instantly forgive, but the interaction opened space for reconciliation. That exchange taught him that influence and affection required vulnerability as well as steadiness. Social intelligence also meant learning scripts and when to break them. He developed a set of conversational templates that served as scaffolding during stressful interactions, a 3-line opener for new people, a 5-step practice for diffusing conflict, a 2-question routine for eliciting someone's values. These scripts were not rigid speeches, but guiding maps. He practiced them in small moments, at cafes, in elevators, during brief calls, so they would be accessible when stakes were high. At a small industry dinner, he used a script to bring a fractured table into cohesion. A debate had turned chilly. People were retreating into defensiveness. He navigated the moment by first acknowledging heat, then asking a focusing question that returned the group to a shared purpose. What outcome would we all be proud of in a year? By choosing the group's longer-term horizon, he shifted attention away from scoring points and toward collaboration.
The exchange did not erase the differences, but it did reorient energy toward constructive work. Part of sustaining this work required vigilance against common traps. He watched for complacency. The danger of assuming competence made further practice unnecessary. He noticed how a few successes could seduce him into old habits, a tempting viral post, a few flattering messages, the thrill of being center stage. He instituted guardrails, weekly reviews of intentions, a practice of soliciting honest external feedback, and a rule to never make high-stakes decisions in the wake of public praise. He also guarded against the corruption of influence, using persuasion for personal gain at others' expense. When a lucrative opportunity arose that required him to bend ethical lines, obscuring obligations to get a deal, he declined.
The decision cost him short-term gain and preserved long-term integrity. He also confronted the web of modern noise, social media, notification economies, the pressure to present a curated self. There were nights when the lure of an attention surge called to him, an easy post that could draw likes and immediate reinforcement. He resisted not by moralizing, but by asking a pragmatic question. What am I trying to accomplish with this post? If the answer was ego rather than generosity, he let it sit. Where posts aimed to share resources, celebrate others, or surface useful ideas, he allowed them. This discipline tamed the hunger for instant signals and aligned his public behavior with his private aim of being useful. A moment of public temptation came when a former peer suggested co-hosting a flashy online event designed to generate mass followers. The format promised quick visibility, bold headlines, heated debates, and provoked takes. He felt the pull, but he imagined the longer arc. Was this event likely to build durable relationships or quick spikes? He declined politely, offering instead to host a smaller, invitation-only roundtable centered on problem-solving. The roundtable produced a handful of deep commitments and 2 collaborative projects over the next year. The choice favored depth over breadth, and again, the returns proved compounding. As months turned into a year and beyond, his attention broadened from individual techniques to systems thinking, designing environments that made the quieter work possible. He arranged his calendar so he had sustained blocks for creative thinking, for relationships, and for rest. He curated a small circle of sparring partners who would gently challenge him and keep him grounded. He built rituals, 1 weekly coffee meeting with an old friend, a monthly audit of promises he'd made to others, a quarterly walkthrough of his network map to ensure he was not hoarding introductions but distributing value. These small systems created momentum that no single strategy could. The man also recognized the responsibility that came with increasing influence. He used it to elevate others deliberately, mentoring promising people, amplifying voices from underrepresented groups, and intentionally sharing credit. He made introductions with context, not just names and emails, because context turned shallow favors into productive collaborations. He found that generosity compounded. Helping 2 people find each other often led to foreshortened timelines on projects, new ventures, and sustained friendships. A moment worth pausing on is how he handled one particularly fraught reconciliation that required both steady boundaries and heartfelt vulnerability. A senior colleague, who had once mentored him but had also wounded him in a public rebuke, came to him after a tense exchange at a conference. The colleague's style was abrasive. Their ego had protected them for decades. The man could have held the old wound as a defense, using the colleague's past harshness as justification to avoid vulnerability. Instead, he scheduled a private conversation, not to rehash, but to seek clarity. He used 3 moves. He acknowledged the past harm, he owned his part in patterns of miscommunication, and he asked an open question about how they might work together more effectively going forward. The colleague responded with a mixture of pride and shame. He admitted some impatience and agreed to try a different rhythm in their interactions. The repair was incomplete and iterative, but the act of engaging with courage and restraint altered the relationship's trajectory.
It did not erase history, but it made future cooperation possible. In the background of all these scenes, the doorway motif persisted. There were hundreds of small thresholds: a hallway before a meeting, the moment before a webinar, the second before answering a text that might inflame or soothe. He treated each threshold as an opportunity to choose orientation. Over time, it became less about a practiced pause and more about an embodied habit. He no longer needed the explicit breath in every doorway. The threshold became a default posture, an orientation toward usefulness and calm. The climactic test of his transformation arrived in a form that exposed both his capacity for presence and his commitment to ethical influence. A startup, he had advised, found itself at a crossroads. A high-stakes investor demanded a change in governance that would have centralized power and weakened the company's mission-driven boards. The founders were torn. On behalf of the board, the man convened conversations with the investor. The negotiation had moral stakes. If mishandled, the company's mission could be compromised. He prepared carefully. He did not rehearse combative lines. He rehearsed clarity of purpose and a plan to surface the investor's underlying incentives. At the meeting, the investor arrived confident and direct. The investor framed the ask in terms of scale, centralized governance to move faster. The man listened, then reframed. Scaling quickly is valuable, but how would centralized governance preserve the mission while accelerating growth? The question shifted the discourse from absolutes to design. He used a mix of tactical moves: empathic labeling when the investor signaled impatience, a clarifying paraphrase to avoid misreading intent, and a calibrated compromise that preserved board protections while creating time-bound mechanisms for faster decisions. He proposed a trial structure. Certain fast-moving decisions could be delegated to a trusted ops committee with sunset clauses and transparent reporting. The investor valued predictability. The founders valued mission fidelity. The structure offered both. Negotiations are rarely tidy. There were moments of high heat when the investor pushed for more power. The man kept returning to outcomes. What would success look like in 18 months, not 3 weeks, and to mutual accountability? He also called in public commitments, documented timelines, mutually agreed metrics, which reduced the temptation for one side to renege later. The investor ultimately agreed to the trial structure. The compromise did not give the investor everything, and it did not give the founders full freedom. What it did was hold both parties to a testable pathway that reduced risk for the company and offered the investor the governance clarity he sought. The result preserved the mission and enabled scaling. More importantly, it demonstrated that steady presence applied to the gravest dilemmas, not just salary talks or social friction, but questions of governance, values, and long-term consequence. The man's role in that moment was not to triumph rhetorically, but to design a field where aligned action could occur. After the dust settled, people remarked on his capacity to hold tough conversations without rancor. It became a reputation that followed him, sometimes to his benefit, sometimes as a burden. Friends asked whether he ever felt exhausted by the expectation to be the calm center. He admitted that it was tiring and required replenishment. He scheduled sabbaticals, creative projects, and time with people who demanded nothing of his leadership. He learned that leadership by presence did not mean endless supply. It required boundaries and recovery. Toward the end of his arc, the man stepped into a new kind of leadership role, not because he sought status, but because his practices made him useful in complex situations. He started mentoring more consistently, creating small cohorts of people learning the practices with him. He taught micro-experiments, the extra heartbeat pause, one more question than feels comfortable, a weekly reach-out to someone in his network simply to ask how they were doing. He emphasized incremental practice and the ethics of influence. He set 3 simple micro-practices as his recommended starting points for anyone ready to experiment. First, a doorway breath. Before entering any meeting or social space, take 3 slow diaphragmatic breaths. Notice any change in posture and tone. Practice twice a day for a week. Second, the paraphrase and ask. In a conversation, paraphrase what the other person just said, 3 to 5 words capturing the core, then ask one open question that probes values rather than facts. Try this in 2 conversations daily. Third, the pause experiment. After a person finishes speaking, count an extra heartbeat before replying, an intentional pause that makes space for deeper input. Use it in 3 consecutive exchanges each day. He taught them not as guarantees, but as ways to shift probability. These practices often increased the likelihood of deeper exchange and better outcomes. He insisted on the ethical imperative: never use these strategies to deceive.
Influence is a lever for helping others, not for exploiting them. As he mentored, he also explored how to keep magnetism from calcifying into posture. He warned against a mechanical presence, a person who behaved as if following a checklist but without genuine curiosity. Authenticity, he taught, was a pattern of alignment. The outside behaviors needed to match internal intentions. When your inner life is oriented toward contribution and care, the external signs of presence follow more naturally. The networks he helped build began to show the return of sustained collaboration. Projects emerged, a local education initiative that connected classrooms with technology partners, a community health program that linked volunteers to clinic resources, a small publishing venture that elevated voices otherwise unheard. The man did not claim credit. He collected notes on each chain of introductions, seeing how tiny acts of generosity had produced disproportionate impact. That compounding felt like the true currency of what he'd chosen, a life designed to add value repeatedly. There were moments when the past threatened to unsettle him. An early loud rival tried once more to provoke him publicly. A social media post mischaracterized his motives and drew a barrage of commentary. He handled these with a consistent template: assess the harm, decide whether a response would repair or inflame, and choose the path that served the community. Sometimes repair required public clarification. Other times, silence and private correction sufficed. He learned that responding to every jab was the quickest path back into noise. The man found comfort in the humility of practice. He kept a notebook of mistakes and what he learned from them. He kept a ledger not of successes, but of calibration notes, moments when his presence failed to land, when a question misfired, and when his assumptions had been wrong. Reflecting on these entries prevented hubris and fostered continuous learning. His identity slowly shifted. Where once he had equated worth with being liked in the moment, he now gauged success by whether his interactions left others better positioned afterward. He found a steadier satisfaction in incremental results, a mentee who had broken a cycle of interruption, a project that moved from idea to pilot, a reconciliation that restored a collaboration. The external applause mattered less, the internal rhythm mattered more. In the final scene, one that felt less like an ending and more like a consolidation, he stood in a doorway that had shifted from practice ground to symbol. The doorway was at the entrance to a small community center where he had been invited to speak about practical presence. The room was full of people from different backgrounds, some loud, some reserved, all carrying their own urgencies. He could feel the old reflex to dazzle. Instead, he took 3 breaths, as he had 1,000 times, and stepped into the room, carrying nothing but intention. He opened not with a performance, but with a question. What in this space would be most useful to you right now? The question redirected attention to need. People answered with specifics: mentoring requests, logistics for events, concerns about sustaining programs. He listened, paraphrased, and then connected 2 people whose projects fit in surprisingly complementary ways. Afterward, someone thanked him for the introductions.
Another said his question had allowed them to speak meaningfully in a setting that often favored spectacle. As the event wound down, he lingered near the doorway, watching people leave differently than they had entered, lighter, more resolved, some carrying new contact details and new energy. The chandelier of public attention could still flash and dazzle in other rooms. Here, at this threshold, something else had happened. Networks had shifted, small structures were in motion, and people had been given space to be useful. Those were outcomes he had come to prize. He understood now that choosing power over noise was not a forever state of quiet perfection. It was an ongoing commitment to a set of practices that increased the odds of useful outcomes. It required humility, continual learning, and an ethical spine. It also required the courage to be visible in ways that did not demand applause, to be steady, to invite others forward, and to accept that the returns might arrive slowly but could multiply meaningfully when they did. Before he left, he wrote 3 lines in his notebook, simple reminders he believed worthy of the listener who had followed his path so far. Influence is a tool. Use it to serve others, not to replace them. Practice small, consistent habits. They build a new default. Choose presence over performance when the stakes are real. If any of this resonates with you, try the 3 micro-practices above this week. Notice what changes in the quality of your conversations and the outcomes you help create. There's no promise of instant fame, only a greater likelihood of meaningful exchange and longer-term influence. He walked out into the night, the doorway behind him warm with ongoing conversations. The rain had stopped. The street smelled faintly of refilled air. He paused, not to perform the breathing that had once been a hard practice, but to offer a final inward check. Was his aim still aligned with service? It was. That alignment had become a North Star. If you want to go further, there is a companion workbook that expands these practices into step-by-step exercises and provides templates for the micro-experiments described here. You can download it through the link in the episode description and use it as a scaffold for developing your own steady presence. He had, in the end, not become an untouchable center of gravity or a figure of flawless control. He had become someone who chose repeatedly to prefer quiet power to loud noise.
That choice changed the way rooms behaved around him, the arc of his relationships, and the scale of the value he could help create. It is a choice you can practice as well, one doorway at a time.